Thank you, Tosh. We're coming close to the hour. I would just want to take a pause and ask if anyone has any pressing questions right now. You can type in the chat box or just unmute yourself and speak.
I wanted to make a comment to Tosh, if I may, because of this continual activism work that we do, and it's funny that this again comes back to the website and back to the content and the need to retell that story over and over and over again in whatever platform you're working in. And that is that we've found in this BC redress file that the community was so perfectly destroyed and destructed and disappeared that the mere suggestion that almost 22,000 citizens or people lived along the West Coast area, occupying 2.6% of the BC population at the time, who all were uprooted and were all dispossessed and were all incarcerated or interned and then permanently displaced, comes as a shock to people. And so, you know, even talking about rights or talking about, you know, protesting, is a lot of folks outside of our community will just sort of look with squinty eyes, you know, just looking at you like, what are you talking about? Because it was so systematically and systemically done so perfectly. And I think that that's something that we should all think about. And that's all I want to say right now.
I just wanted to add to that. I think I was very idealistic when I first started working in the community because redress had just happened. And I mentioned that euphoric moment when the community thought what was ahead of us now was rebuilding this community now that we had won our rights and justice, justice had come. But over the next decades, it became very clear that exactly what Suzanne is talking about is the need for that history and to be re-spoken, re-embodied, but with each new generation, it needs to come up in new ways. So it's very difficult because it could be just a case of reproducing the same old narrative with the same old stereotypes. But I think what's amazing about Suzanne's work, John's work, and all of the individuals who took part in this process is the way that history is made to make sense now. And it refers to and draws on not just personal experiences, but political, aesthetic experiences. So we're constantly having to do that. And again, I was very naive when I first started. I thought, you know, it's been done, we can move on, we can rebuild. But it was only the beginning. And there are so many issues today with the community that we have to rethink, reconsider, and so on.
I mean, if you don't mind if I jump in there, I think that one of my big takeaways from this project that I appreciate you saying, Kirsten, is the political activism of today. Like for me, this project is like a clear connection for me that I have a lineage of protesters, of people who are recognizing injustice and speaking out against it. And that's where, like, when I hear displacement, when I see the displacement of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and that like absolute injustice there, that like there's something deep inside of me that like wants to like just scream and like push back against that. And part of this is recognizing that that is kind of it's inherited almost, and it's really, I think, enlightening for me to see that I'm part of that kind of lineage, and that my strong sense of, you know, viewing injustice and wanting to act against it has, yeah, I've had enlightenment from that, and us continuing to speak out against these injustices that are taking place currently on our land is so important for us moving forward as well.
I just want to quickly say that it was through Roy Meekie's work and other redress activist work that I read from the 80s and 90s that I found out about my great-grandfather's work. And just as you're saying, Laura, that empowerment of learning this intergenerationally, it's who you are. And so that empowers you. And I think that's exactly what Suzanne, this production is doing. It's empowering and making those intergenerational links. It's reminding us and enacting who we are. So I think that's incredibly important. So thank you.
Does any of our other speakers like to jump in, or I'll just read a couple comments from our audience that are in the chat box. Sachiko says, I like to hear about the role of protest letters when the writer does not know whether the letter will be effective. Context here in Ottawa, we have been under siege for weeks and we need an outlet to express our rage and despair, but we know that writing to the occupiers will not have the desired effect.
I can say a little bit to that,
Yeah.
at least in context of this exhibit. We know that, even though these letters that are featured in the exhibit are ones that were collected by the government and reviewed by them, they went unheard. So they're filed by Frank Shears alongside copies of the responses that were mainly form letters. They're really quite heartless if you look at them together with the really impassioned text of the Japanese Canadians. But we know that these were not effective. I think there's maybe one case of a Japanese Canadian who actually succeeded in getting his property back from this dispossession. And the authors of these letters that we're looking at in this exhibit did not get any compensation. They never got their property back. And, the redress movement and all the community work that happened after that was the response to that could never make up for that initial loss, even though it did so much to bring back our community in other ways. So for us, I think as we, as a team for this exhibit went through these letters, it was really powerful to see that even though they essentially went unheard at the time, we could still find them in the archive today and share them with the world in this way and show what those things meant at the time for these people, and those voices were preserved in their letters.
I think one thing I might want to say about this, especially since my wife is very much involved in activism today, particularly with the TMX pipeline and stuff like that. I think if you look at one individual act of activism, it's very rare that one act of activism can turn the tide, but it is about contributing to the wave of activism that you hope will eventually start changing minds and create more of the culture against something. So I think no act is wasted, and it's really about being able to contribute in ways that don't burn yourself out, because when it comes to any sort of societal shift, we are running a marathon. We are not doing a sprint. And to speak to what Carolyn is saying, to see these letters, having an effect and affecting people today, it is part of a larger moment than the one that we're necessarily living in the here and now.
I'll also jump in here. While protest letters might not necessarily create change right away, what, for me personally, seeing 300 protest letters from the Japanese Canadian community allowed me, as someone who hasn't been connected to the community, learn that in fact, there was resistance, because up until that point, I assumed the Japanese Canadian community was weak and didn't stand up and did nothing and went happily to the internment camps. And so you can imagine finding out that in fact was not the case was very powerful for me, and it really has changed my narrative, because I had an education on all of this, and it's very important for the healing of our community in order to have access to this information.
And that's, Carmel, what you went through was exactly through what the Sansei in the 60s and 70s went through when they began to learn what happened to their families. They realized those little towns in their photograph albums weren't little towns their families lived in, they were internment camps. And not all Japanese Canadians were silent, because there's this myth about silence in the community. That is a narrative, as Mona Oikawa so eloquently writes in her book, that has been produced by white scholars, white sociologists, white writers, the silent passive Japanese Canadian. So we're constantly trying to undo that. And one of the sources is to look back at the legacy exactly, and that's why these letters are so important, but also the writing, the art of Japanese Canadians, which now for some is harder to access because it's analog, it's not digital, but you can't just rely on Google search or the digital to find this work, because, and that's where museums become important. That's where cultural events become important. So I think what you're saying is very important, and it reiterates what Suzanne said about the need to keep, like, it seems like repeating the history in these political acts, but in new ways, and it's a constant renewal of that and a constant building on it from the generations today.
Can I jump in here? One thing that we were very conscious of when we were putting this exhibit together was the fact that we were not trying to provide a recipe for other communities. Like, this is how this is not how activism could work across all communities. This is very much a specific situation that the Japanese Canadians found themselves in. I think it's a very unique in Canada's history of colonialism. It's a very unique situation. And the fact that we had these 4 or 7 years that sort of broke up the community. So I think we're not trying to globalize it. We were trying to show this is how our community dealt with it. And there are many, many layers that even today are still being uncovered. Like, for instance, as some people have said that, there was this image, I think when I joined the community when I was when I was 19, that the community basically sort of rolled over and gave up and said, take us away to the camps without fighting back. But I think as we've sifted through those layers of history in our community, that we've seen that it's much more complex than that. And I think that's one thing we were trying to get across in this website, those layers of complexity and how we dealt with that situation and are still dealing with it today.
Thank you, everyone, for that lively discussion. Really quickly, for our panelists to answer the last question we have prepared for them, which is, what is the impact or significance of these letters for you? Since we're running out of time, I like just to encourage everyone to keep it tight. And we'll just go around one last time with all of our panelists. So maybe we'll do Suzanne and John and our community speakers. So if Suzanne, you want to go first?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, and I'll be super brief. I mean, in reading one letter is a very, very emotional experience. Reading 300 letters is a terrifying experience. And I think that the impact of the letters is, as spoken by the previous conversations that we've had, is a good thing. But I think the big thing is that understanding that many, many people who had invested their lives into this new land and had built lives were very, very aware that this was wrong. And they were simply stating their case in plain fact, and that it landed with indifference, I think, and quiet indifference within a regular bureaucratic, system that could be a system today in a different way, is I think something to really think about and to do and to talk about and do more work around. So that's what I want to say about the letters.
John?
I think I've pretty much said everything. I just would encourage, I'm just like preaching to the choir here, but I would just encourage everyone to delve, right? The more you delve into community and into your own history, the more rises to the surface. And I think it can't do anything except help you build up a more rich and in-depth story of who we are as Japanese Canadians and as Canadians and as people living here on this territory.
Laura, do you have any last thoughts?
History lives, history is alive, and it lives in us, in our bodies. And yeah, there's so much more I can say, but there's one line that one of Suzanne's students says in one of the videos we filmed together, and it's be vigilant, because history also repeats itself with accuracy. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that this sort of echoes a lot of what's being said, but I think the letters, show that we are a part of a continuum, of a long line, and we need to, maintain that same vigilance and keep pushing forward for what we want to see in the world.
My thoughts are that, wow, that generation of Japanese Canadians asked hard questions. They asked critical questions, and they stood up for justice. And so I think that says a lot about who we can be. It's not necessarily who like Japanese Canadians are today, but I think this is again why it's important to think intergenerationally. And this isn't just the past, part of the history. Redress in many ways has made that past safe for a lot of people to talk about, in the broader Canadian society. But we have to keep alive what is potent and what's transformative about that political moment now. I think that's a responsibility we have. Yes, so that's what I want to say.
As for me, I learned a lot, and there's an article that John Endo Greenaway did for the January issue of the Gepo Bulletin that I'm going to put a link in the chat here. I go into much deeper detail as to what the experience was, but what I want to talk about is what transpired since having read the letter. I found out that there was a home that my great-grandmother owned in Vancouver in Kitsilano, and I lived in Kitsilano for years and had no idea that I was living a few blocks from where she once used to be. And in May 2021, along with my friend Trisha, who I think is also on the call here, we hopped onto our bicycles and we videoed the experience of going to that location in Kitsilano. And, times have changed. It's now a condominium, but the street is lined with cherry blossom trees. And it was a really emotional moment for me to have come full circle, reading the letter, learning about this house, and then going to the location. And that sparked an interest from other people who are like me, who are trying to retrace their roots and figure out stuff and connect the dots. And they also want to hop on their bicycles and go to these locations and do it with community, with people who get it, who understand what that experience is like. And so I feel there needs to be some support also for the community to do that. It's very important because doing it alone is very difficult, but doing it in community is also, it's beautiful and it's healing. And the last thing I wanted to share is that I wear another hat, Genocide Prevention BC, and I regularly go into classrooms to talk about my other side of the family's experience with the Holocaust, but also my other side of the family's experience with Japanese Canadian internment. And it is shocking that there's no knowledge of either for most students when I go into a classroom, whether it's social studies, history, or genocide studies 12. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done there. We need more people who are speaking about what's happened to their families and in ways that can connect to future generations.
Tosh, did you want to share some last words?
Oh, well, I think the more protest letters, the better, because it gives the general public exactly what happened to all the Japanese Canadians that were incarcerated. So.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists, thank you so much for that thought-provoking discussion. And we've got some wonderful conversations happening in the chat box too. We encourage you to keep having these conversations. And that concludes the panel discussion portion of our event today. On behalf of the Nikkei National Museum, I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing your experiences and wisdom. And to our audience, thank you for joining us in support of our museum programs. Please stay in touch via social media and our website. I'll just post some links right now. Okay. And we hope to see you at future events.